So why don't you tell us a little bit about David?
Well, my brother, David Robert Kink, was a helicopter pilot during the Vietnam War. He was killed at age 19 in August 1969. And I had just turned 8 years old. So I knew very little about what he did in Vietnam and really didn't have a lot of memories of him because I was so young and there was an age difference.
Yeah,
He
he's pretty
attended,
young too. How long had he been there in
he
Vietnam?
had, he had been in Vietnam for 1 month, had attended flight school at Fort Walters, Texas, and then Hunter Stewart Army Airfield in Savannah, Georgia, prior to going to Vietnam in June of 1969.
Mm. And where did you and David grow up?
We grew up in a small town called Middleton, Wisconsin, outside of Madison. And he graduated from high school in 1967 in Middleton and wasn't really sure what he wanted to do with his life. He was working in a men's clothing store after graduating. And I think he joined the Army in the high school to flight school program because he wanted to learn how to fly. And that was his ambition and his reason for going.
Mm. So he volunteered.
Yes, he did. Yes.
Mm. Mhm. So you said that you were 8 years old at the time, and you don't have a lot of memories. What memories do you have?
Well, I remember him modeling his flight suit for us when he was home the last time before going to Vietnam, and he was smiling, really smiling. There were, I think, 100 zippers on his flight suit, it seemed to me as a little girl, and I do remember that. My mother went to Savannah, Georgia to pin his wings on when he graduated from flight school in May of 1969. I remember her leaving for that trip and being very excited about it. It was a great achievement. He was very happy to be have achieved flight school and become a real life helicopter pilot.
Mm. Yeah, more zippers is better, right?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. So how is it that he came to be killed a month into his tour?
Well, he had been flying Huey helicopters when he first reached Vietnam. And the day that the crash occurred, July 21st, 1969, was David's second day in a Loach, a light observation helicopter. And they were doing bomb damage assessment or recon by fire, looking for areas that had been disturbed, and came on an area that the Highbird Cobra aircraft above them fired upon, and there was a ground explosion that brought the Loach down. And it turned out to be an unexploded 250-pound or 500-pound US bomb that the enemy had camouflaged, hoping that the Americans would do as they did, poke around. The ground explosion brought the aircraft down, and because my brother was flying as observer on that side of the aircraft, he was the only one to survive the crash of the three-man crew. He crawled out away from the helicopter and was evacuated and died of his injuries 12 days later on August 3rd, 1969. None of that did I know at the time, and nor did my family know any of that information until many years later in 1996, when I stumbled upon the Vietnam Helicopter Pilots Association and learned that they keep the records of all of the helicopters and the pilots who flew during the Vietnam War. And so I learned a lot of information about what actually happened during the crash 25, 26 years after the fact.
Yeah. So what triggered it? I mean, what triggered your effort 25 years later?
Well, it took me that long to really get the courage to look for information about my brother, what kind of person he was, what he did in Vietnam. Because at the time during the Vietnam War, as you know, America really wanted to forget about the war and about those who served and those who didn't come back. And it was just a somewhat of a taboo subject. Growing up, I really never shared the fact that I had lost my brother with my friends growing up. I went to high school, graduated, went to college, graduated, never really learned about the Vietnam War in school. And I felt guilty because of that. I remember when I turned 19 years old, almost the entire year, I felt very uncomfortable because I was getting to be older than my older brother was. And finally, I started thinking, you know, I'd like to know what kind of person he was. What did he laugh at? What did he cry at? What was he good at? I really didn't know what my brother was like. And so I started poking around, looking for information out there, started searching the internet, and came upon the organizations that really helped me a great deal. One of which was Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund and the In Touch program, that at the time was a connecting program between those who served in Vietnam and families of those who were lost. So there's some resources out there that I just found on my own that were never really known about, and I think that's still the case. It bothers me that there are still so many family members like myself who have no idea that there are organizations that are out there that are helping make these connections. And so it's been a very important part of my life over the last 25, 28 years, helping other people try and make those connections, because there's a lot of need there for us as family members of those who were lost to connect with the still living veterans, because they help us learn not only how our loved ones died, but more importantly, how they lived. And that's really what's important to us, I think, is to know something about them and the things that they did in their short lives, because they had a place in this world just as we do.
Mm. One of the things I find most moving about the story of your search for your brother is the relationships you built along the way. I mean, you didn't just use the Pilots Association, the Crew Members Association as resources. Like, you became kind of a kid sister to a lot of those guys. So can you talk a little bit about that?
I'd love to. I have, I lost one of my big brothers. I have many hundreds of new big brothers. I affectionately call them that. And many, many years ago, when I first started searching for people who knew my brother, one of the pilots wrote to me, "Your brother was our brother." And that was a new concept to me. I thought, wow, this is a group that is welcoming my questions and my hunger to know information about what they did. And
And that was
so
surprising.
it was totally surprising to me, because I grew up thinking nobody wants to talk about Vietnam. I I thought that I would cause nothing but pain to people whom I inquired about what was the war like and what was it like to fly helicopters, because I grew up with those terrible stereotypes. I thought the Vietnam veterans were all whacked out, crazy, um, didn't want to share any of their painful memories. I thought they were all ready to explode at a moment's notice. And so it took great courage for me to even ask questions and try and find people. I learned just the opposite. Our questions about what it was like during the time when they were at the pinnacle of their youth and their vigor, and so proud of the achievements that they made and their service, that to have someone come around and ask about that, there's an instant connection there, and there's a bond. And the people that those of us who lost someone whose name is on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall will be connected with the living veterans who came home in a way that I don't know any other life connection that is that type of a bond. It's really a strong bond, and it's family, sometimes stronger than family.
Mm. So, what did you learn from your new adopted big brothers about David and how he lived?
I learned that he had a droll, dry sense of humor. I learned that he probably would have made a good pilot had he flown more and survived the war. That he was a friend to people and well liked. That he couldn't always hold his liquor. I had some funny stories related to me about brawling on the bus on the way to the flight line during flight school, and going to restaurants and getting in trouble as teenagers do sometimes when they overstep their bounds and their maturity level. And I learned that he was one of a small percentage of people who actually did get through flight school, that it was a real tough thing in order to become a pilot. And that meant that you were kind of in the upper echelons of all those who had entered flight school. Not everyone graduated, but David did. And I'm proud of him for that. I feel that I know him now more than I knew him before, through people who I had never met before in my life, who gave my past back to me. I look at it as having lost all of these years in between, and I think my brother would have helped me with my first house. He would have helped me care for my aging parents. He would have been interested in my life and my career. Um, but now I feel that I know him better in death because of those helicopter pilots and crew members who cared enough to share the stories with me about what it was like to be that far away from home and to have $1 million aircraft underneath your butt and be in charge of other people's lives. I know what some of the moments were like that David would have gone through as a helicopter pilot. And I would never have ever had all of that information and that comfort had not his fellow helicopter pilots, even those who didn't know him, but still they did. They knew what he would have gone through had they not been kind enough to accept me as a little sister, because I think a lot of them realize if they had been the one who had not come home, they would hope that someone would help their family to understand. And so that's just what they're doing with me.
Mm. What did you learn about the role of helicopters in that war?
Well, when I was growing up, the sound of a helicopter was the sound of sadness. And in the rare instances when one would fly overhead, my mother would look up at the sky and she would kind of put her head down. And I knew that she was grieving for the son she lost to the skies over Vietnam. I learned over the last many years that that sound was the sound of hope. If you were fighting in the Vietnam War, if you were a grunt on the ground, or if you were another crew member or someone waiting for a dust-off medical evacuation helicopter, that meant that you were going to get out of there, that you were going to get resupplied with food, ammunition, more troops. It was the sound that really drove the war in a way. And so I know that the helicopter pilots were looked up to a great deal, from their peers as well as from the guys who they were carrying back and forth to work every day, who were on the ground. And so it's the icon of the Vietnam War. But I guess now I know, hey, there was more than one kind of helicopter there. There was a light observation helicopter, there was the Cobra, there was the CH-47, there were Chinooks, there were Hueys, there were Slicks, there were dust-offs, there were troop carriers. There's a lot I don't know, but I do know a lot more than when I started.
Yeah, it's no wonder that those those pilots and crew members you've met along the way have sort of adopted you as a kid sister. I mean, I think they must respond to that curiosity, right? That you're genuinely interested in all things helicopter in terms of, you know, just the Vietnam War in particular.
I am, and I don't mean to make it sound like an obsession, um, but I see a great value in what someone who did what my brother did, being able to connect with a family member like myself, even if someone who was killed whom they didn't know. There's so much information that can be shared about what the days were like. Um, you know, I mean, the only thing I knew about Vietnam was that it was a little pink spot on the map, and that was a long way away from home, and that was where my brother was, and we sent him Kool-Aid in care packages because I guess the water was bad and you couldn't drink the water. That's about all I knew. When his personal effects came home, they had a musty, moldy smell that I'll never ever forget. And um, having been to Vietnam now many times, visited myself, I know that it's a country, not the name of a war. It's the name of a country where there are people just like me and you who are living their lives every day and just struggling with the same things that we struggle with, and joys and sorrows just like we are. And there are beautiful parts to Vietnam. I've seen some of the most breathtaking mountain passes, and driven over some of the most beautiful scenery. And so for me, it really turned the word Vietnam from the name of a war into the name of a place. And I feel much better because I know that there was there was beauty that my brother had to have seen when he was in the country also, as well as the horrible stuff. And war is a mixture. It's something that changes your life forever, but it, it there are a lot of bonds that come out of tragedy that are stronger than you could ever imagine.
Sure. Yeah. I definitely want to come back to, I want to talk more about that, about your trips to Vietnam
Sure.
and the reasons for them and the work that you've done there and continue to do there. But before we do that, you know, it just occurred to me that, you know, the 25-year gap
Mhm.
is probably explained to some degree by the fact that there was no internet, right? You kind of had to wait for the internet to really dig in.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right.
Yeah. So, you know, as you sort of, I mean, you're almost like an explorer, kind of hacking your way through the jungle with a machete, right? You're blazing the trail for people who came after you, in terms of discovering what the resources are, and you know where you can go for information. Um, you know, were there any surprises along the way for you as you started to collect and categorize these different resources?
Well, Michael, I thought I was the last person in the door on this. I mean, I thought certainly by 25 years, 30 years after the Vietnam War, everyone in my position who had a loved one who was killed, who was looking for information, would have already done it. I thought I was a latecomer. And I was very surprised that in all my growing up, I never knew another single other person who had lost someone in the Vietnam War until 1996. And the first couple of family members that I communicated with who had also lost either a father or a brother, and didn't have information such as myself, I was very surprised.
Hmm.
And as time went by and there were further efforts, and a committee was formed to assist with those cases and make family connections with living veterans, I learned that I was not alone. It was very common for families of the time to not be given a lot of information about what happened. And I always tell people if my brother had been killed in a car accident, I probably would know kind of what happened and who else was involved. where it happened, what some of the particulars were. With the Vietnam death, I didn't know the names of the two men whose lives ended the same instant that my brother's life started to end. I never even knew their names. I didn't know the two names of the pilot and other pilot and the gunner on the aircraft. I didn't know exactly where it happened or what type of aircraft it was. I didn't know about the course of my brother's treatment during the 12 days that he was in the hospital until seeking those things out for myself 20, 25, 26 years later. And that was a surprise. I also was surprised at um, the tremendous, shall I say, the pride that was kind of covered up in so many returning Vietnam veterans who weren't always treated well when they came home from the war and came home, went about their lives, raised a family, had their careers, and then found themselves thinking, as I was, each in our separate corners, what about this thing? What about this war? How did it change me? And what happened to the other guys that I served with? So there were many Vietnam veterans who were, I think, going along a parallel path to myself, thinking a lot in the intervening years about their buddies with whom they served, and those that didn't come home, as well as those who did, and starting to think, hey, maybe there's some value to this. Maybe there's something that making that connection with my past and the people from my past can add to my life. And it's been wonderful to see those connections being made between veterans, and to go to a veterans reunion and to see pats and slaps on the back and sharing of the funny stories and embarrassing each other and sitting around in the hotel bar and telling, as they say, telling lies. And it's just wonderful to see that, because you know that they meant so much to each other then. And there have been so many reconnections. That's been a really good thing about the internet. In large part due to the formation of a lot of websites, organizations, and people are able to connect with email and finding each other. And so there's a lot of military reunions out there that looks like a lot of old gray-haired guys sitting around shooting the breeze, but it's a lot more than that.
Mhm. What are some of the websites or online communities that you've discovered that you wish more people knew about? Ones that are particularly helpful, but maybe not as well known.
Well, there are unit associations. Many units have their own website and a webmaster who takes care of rosters and swapping information back and forth and posting a lot of photos of the time. So if family members know their loved one's unit, they probably can find a unit website online. The Vietnam Helicopter Pilots Association, of course, which is the first organization that was so helpful to me, and the Vietnam Helicopter Crew Members Association, both have websites, annual reunions. The 1st Cavalry Division Association has an annual reunion and a great bi-monthly newspaper and subgroups. There are also some information sources on the internet. The Kofelt database of Vietnam casualties is a wonderful resource for anyone searching for information about those who were killed in the Vietnam War. And it surpasses anything I've ever seen as far as documentation and the basics on the casualty. So you can look up the report of casualty and look up who their family members were notified at the time of their death, as well as their military occupational specialty, MOS, and when the event occurred. The VHPA, Vietnam Helicopter Pilots Association, has on its website a list of all of the helicopter incidents by date, or you can look up KIA by name and find the records for that particular aircraft, when it was serviced, who were the crew members who were in it at the time when it crashed, And that's a wonderful online resource, as well as a database of their members. Um, there's a there's a ton of information out there. The really, since I'm talking to you, Michael, I hope that everybody knows about posting tributes. There are many there are many website tribute places where people can go and post tributes to those who were killed in the Vietnam War, including the Wall of Faces, which is a great place to keep checking back to see if other people have posted after you. And the virtual wall, originally online tribute source for Vietnam casualties, and photos as well as memories can be posted in these places. It's just, you got to go out there and look and keep looking.
Hmm. So let's talk a little bit about your many trips to Vietnam. Tell me about the first one. Why did you go, and what did you learn there that kept you coming back?
Well, in Christmas time, 1996, I trudged out to the mailbox, and in the mailbox was a card from someone who had read my letter in the VHPA newsletter. And he wrote to me that the bonds formed in combat are sometimes stronger than family, and that he had been flying the Cobra aircraft above my brother on that last mission when my brother's aircraft had crashed. His name was John Powell, and I was so happy to make his acquaintance. He's since become a dear friend, and he's also since become the person who, for military historical tours, takes tours back to many different battlefield sites, including Vietnam. And so in 2006, John Powell and Military Historical Tours was organizing a trip to Vietnam. And I decided to go. I was privileged to be with John on that trip to Vietnam, knowing that he was directly involved with my brother and a couple of other veterans who served in Charlie Troop 1st of the 9th Cav with my brother at the time, and their wives. And my roommate on that first trip to Vietnam was the birth daughter of John Anderson, the other pilot who was killed in my brother's Loach crash. I had made her acquaintance a couple years earlier, and so we shared our thoughts and feelings about being in that country every night before we'd go to sleep. And it was a great thing. My biggest concern was that I would step off the airplane and I would be bombarded with that musty overseas smell that David's personal effects had when they came home from Vietnam. And I thought, if this is going to be 2 weeks of this, this is not going to go well for me. But it was not the case. It was a wonderful tour, south, north, all over the place, including somewhat close to where the crash had occurred outside of Saigon, and made some great lifelong friendships with the other people who were on the tour. And after coming home, went back again 3 years later on another tour, and have been to Vietnam many times since, and developed friendships with our tour guide and his family who are there, who are very dear. And to see other people experiencing that on the tours is great. I didn't have a strong feeling that I wanted to be in the place where my brother had crashed. And that's just my own personal preference. I think my brother would rather have me see where he lived and where he flew. And so I did. I saw Phuc Vinh area, saw the area where that used to be the runway where they would take off, and the little village that's there, and saw some of the beauty and some of the remnants of war that are still very much present for that country. And it's not for everybody. And I tell veterans that too a lot. It's not for every veteran to go back and revisit those times, but for those who want to, I'd say do it. Do it soon. There's a lot of different ways that you can go back to Vietnam. And I have made friendships with some other Gold Star family members who have gone back and experienced some real healing that comes from that.
I believe when we spoke earlier, you mentioned some trips that you've taken with your husband, who's a Medal of Honor winner. And can you talk a little bit about his trips to Vietnam?
Certainly. My husband, Mike Sprayberry, I met him. He was on that 2006 trip to Vietnam. And that's when we met, and he was on the 2009 trip as well, and we stayed in touch, and one thing led to another, and so here we are married. And he was in the A Sha Valley, which is a place in Vietnam that anyone who's there knows was a horrific place to be at the time, and some deep valleys and high mountains and very difficult flying and difficult battles that took place. And in April of 1968, he was involved in activity there that led to his receiving the Medal of Honor, and also resulted in 3 men from his unit who still remain missing, who were never able to be found, and another 3 troopers from a helicopter, which was also the 1st of the 9th, which was my brother's unit, that flew in looking for those missing 3 guys a few days after the battle and crashed also, and those 3 have never been found. And my husband is involved in trying to help locate veterans, other veterans who have diaries, sketches, memories of the time, who can help pinpoint the locations where those guys may be. And a lot has changed. There's been washouts and monsoons, and roads have been built, and there's been a lot of time that has passed, but he feels very strongly that these guys should, if we can at all return them from their last place of duty, they should be brought home. He's made connections with their families, and I know some of their families also, and it's an important thing to just try everything possible to see if those guys can be brought home.
You know, you mentioned your relationship with John Powell, who was on the scene when your brother's helicopter was shot, when it crashed, rather.
Yeah.
I'm going to take another run at that. I'll edit it.
That's okay.
You mentioned your relationship with John Powell, who was on the scene when your brother's helicopter crashed, and it made me think. You know, your brother was the only survivor of that crash at the time, and you said he crawled away from the aircraft. Did you ever meet the people who got him out of there? Were you able to find out who evacuated him?
I was able to meet and to thank, very importantly, to thank the pilot who from the same unit was the first one to the scene of the crash and helped put my brother on the medevac helicopter. His name was Luther Russell, and he's since passed away, but we became very close. And for me to be able to stand in front of him and put my arms around him, he was a huge guy, and to say thank you to him for doing that was a highlight of my life. What happened on July 21st, 1969 was that they had a down bird alarm in all of the hooches, and whenever a bird went down, everybody was en route to the location as soon as humanly possible. And so Russell jumped in his aircraft and unfortunately had a blade strike against a tree when he was landing, and he got in trouble for that. But he was one of the ones who helped put David on the medevac, and it was somewhat vindicating, I think, for him to be able to finally meet me and to know that, hey, this was a good thing, even though he had problems with getting into the site, that he had done something that was a good thing. And a lot of guys who lost unit members in Vietnam never knew what happened to them after the war. They didn't know if they survived in the hospital or did they never come home. And so there were people that I talked with who really wondered about my brother. They thought, well, he probably survived because all they knew was that he had gone to the hospital. Um, so there's another connection. I mean, sometimes the human need to say thank you to someone is as great as the need to hear it. And I love I loved Russell. I really loved him as a brother, and as I love John Powell. These are people who are part of my heart. They're part of my family, truly.
Hmm. You know, you've discovered so much. I mean, it's been such a fascinating journey, from my point of view, right? To consider, what once you started looking for your brother, all of the wonderful things that you discovered. I wonder, were you able to share any of that with your parents?
Well, you're very kind. Who knows if things are fascinating to one person and fascinating to another, but it's 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 incredible for me. And I was able to share some of this with both of my parents. I'm the tail end of a family of four, so they were both practically fossils when I was born. And
Mm.
so my mother actually met one of my new big brothers who came to where we lived on a trip, and was able to meet her. And I shared letters with her. My dad had the beginning of Alzheimer's when my search first started, and so I was able to share some of the information with him. Parents grieve differently, and my mother's grief at the time was red and raw and out there, and she wanted to take anyone she could to task for my brother's death, and all of the errors that happened in his situation. There was a lot of misinformation and so forth. And my dad grieved more quietly. In fact, I wondered at the time if he grieved at all. And men and women, as you know, have different ways of handling emotions. And yet, we, when I was a young adult, I went to visit my dad, and we went to the cemetery where David was buried, and Dad knew right away where his grave was. And he hung his head down, and he just said something about David being all boy and just really missing him. And I knew at that moment that my dad's loss was just as great as my mother's. But they were able to know a little bit about my connections with some of these helicopter pilots, which I'm very glad, before they both died. And when I first met anyone in person was after I'd been communicating by email with some of the pilots for several months. And one of them invited me to go out to Washington, D.C. at Veterans Day to a gathering that they had there. And so my mother, who I lived nearby, was elderly at the time. And I went to her apartment and said, Mom, I'm going to go on my own and fly out to Washington, D.C. and meet a bunch of Vietnam veterans that I met over the internet. And she was a little bit concerned, as mothers are, and was always very protective of me anyway growing up, but it worked out very well. And I'm just so thankful that in their later years they were able to know that, hey, there were some guys who cared a lot about David, and things are starting to be okay now.
Mm.
That's
You
important.
mentioned, sorry, I didn't mean to
That's
cut
it.
you off.
Fine. That's all.
Um, you you uh you mentioned other siblings. It hadn't even occurred to me to ask about other siblings. How do they relate to you and David, in age, and what has your search meant to them?
Well, thanks for asking. I have an older brother, Paul, who is 20 years older than I am. And my brother David was 11 years older than I am. And my sister Susan, who is 9 years older than myself. And then there's me. And I think that Paul and Susan had more memories of David, certainly because of their ages being closer to his. And I think that when he was killed, they sort of lost their past. I mean, they knew a little bit more what they had lost. And I, in being 7 at the time that he went to Vietnam, feel like I lost more my future. I really didn't know what I had lost. But they have I've been the one to do the legwork and do the searching and the communicating, but I've shared what I've learned with them, and I think it's really helped them too in knowing that it's okay now to talk about these things. It's okay to talk about the Vietnam War, and that there were veterans who survived the war who came back and are wonderful people and are okay with talking about things and sharing with family members, because I think that was a revelation to them too. We can't I can't begin to express how very different things were in 1969 than they are today, as far as community, society's relationship with Gold Star families. It's a total 180, in my opinion.
Hmm. That's actually a great segue. Can you do you remember? That's a stupid question. Of course, you remember. Uh, can you talk a little bit about your first visit to the wall?
Oh, my first visit to the wall was unforgettable. It was at night. It was raining. I had flown from Minnesota, where I lived, out to Washington D.C., and I was staying with a cousin who lived there, and so I was on my own as far as transportation. I got on the metro, the subway, and I got off at the stop that it said on the map that was closest to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and I was going to meet some of the pilots and crew members who were gathering there. 7 o'clock at night, I got off the metro and asked somebody, which way is the Vietnam Wall? And they said, well, go about 6 blocks that way and go about 4 blocks that way. And so I was kind of late and I was running. And I remember the sidewalk ended. I had to cross this busy street and it was dark. But I met the guys who were there, and I think they purposely chose a nighttime visit to the wall for their first time. It was a group of pilots and crew members who were involved in what's called the Vietnam Helicopter Flight Crew Network, an internet listserv of helicopter pilots and crews. And we saw the wall, and there were raindrops on it. You know, you've seen when the wall is wet, particularly at night, and things are shiny and it looks like tears coming down. And someone helped me find my brother's name, and I touched it, and it was okay. So there it is. And this wall is a huge, huge place. It's mammoth. When you first see it, I think nighttime is a good time to see it the first time, because otherwise it might just knock you over. But it's a incredible thing to be with people to whom those names mean as much as that one name means to you. And to be there during the daylight, to be there first thing in the morning on a Memorial Day when there are memories and mementos left there, or on a Veterans Day. My brother was born on Veterans Day, November 11th, 1949. So I feel that when I go to the wall on Veterans Day, I feel kind of like it's a happy birthday, David, and see all these people who come and visit the wall on David's birthday is a neat thing. But just to be there and go and see that, hey, your person, your name is one among 58,000 plus on here, you feel not so alone. I think that I was alone with Vietnam for a long time, many, many years. And I'm not alone with Vietnam anymore. I'm with other people who went through the same thing I went through. So you just feel that here's this wonderful tribute, this wonderful monument that's there. You feel that all those people are with you, behind you. And I think the most important part of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, the surface is important. What's behind is important, and certainly the statues and the wonderful Vietnam Women's Memorial and my friend Diane Carlson Evans. But the two the 1 or 2 feet that's right in front of the wall of names is where all of the action occurs. You can stand at the end of that wall and look down and see things that are happening to the people that are standing in front of that wall. And if you stand there for a moment and just observe, it's a very powerful thing. And that little bit of space there that's right in front of the wall is sacred. It's an important thing for people to go and see that.
Mm. Your brother's name, how close to his name are the names of the other men who died in that crash?
There's several lines different. So my
Mm.
brother's name he's on line 92, panel 20 west, and the other names are quite high on that panel. And that tells a story, because you see here, this is a space of 12 days. This is how many names just in that amount of time. So there are many stories that are on the wall, as far as the plus signs and the diamonds, as you know, and missing. And you can take 2 dates and look and see how many lines or panels represent those 2 dates. And you can learn a lot just from looking at it.
Yeah, it is a narrative.
It is, yes, good word.
Yeah. Have you been able to connect with family members of the other two men who died on the same aircraft?
Yes, the birth daughter of the other pilot, who was the aircraft commander, is a friend, and she has a young family, and it's been great to be able to connect with her. In 1996, I wrote a letter to the family of the gunner who was killed on the crash, after having a little help with finding their name and finding them in Ohio. I had not heard from them when I first went out to the wall, but I sent a letter saying I was going to the wall, and if they would like to have me get a name rubbing of their son's name for them, I'd be happy to do that. I was very hesitant, and I was very concerned with the fact that my brother, as flying as observer, getting his so-called scout eyes at the time of the crash, I was thinking, okay, did David see this target that they ended up firing upon, which caused the ground explosion? And in that sense, would these other two families be upset with David because maybe it was his eyes that saw the target that ended up ending the lives of those other two men? It sounds crazy now, and yet that is how the uneducated mind works. And there's so much blame going around, especially during the Vietnam War, and you start to think, are people going to be down on him and feel that he's to blame for this? Well, now I know how silly that sounds, but I was very cautious about not wanting to intrude on other family members' grief, not wanting to cause anybody any pain or bring up any bad memories. When I got home from Washington, D.C., that first Veterans Day, the first time, I had a letter waiting for me from the family of the gunner, who just basically said he was one of, I think, 4 or 6 kids, and they had other sons who were serving in the military, and that they greatly missed him. And it was very kind of me to reach out and write to them that they had been to the wall and had gotten a name rubbing of Mike's name, and just thanking me. What a relief it was for me to get that, and to know that it was okay for me to connect with them, and that they weren't thinking, oh, this is a horrible, unwanted thing. And more as I've gone on in this journey, I've found that it's okay to bring up things, because these guys had a life, and they were walking around here on this earth. It's okay to remember them. And I try, and I'm involved with a lot of other Gold Star family members like myself, like hundreds of them. And I am conscious of anniversary dates. I look on my calendar and I see the anniversary date when my brother was, when he died, August 3rd. I see anniversary dates of when my dear other family members, brothers or fathers or cousins were killed. And I send them a little email just saying, I'm thinking about you today. I'm thinking about your dear brother, or thinking about your family and your father. And some anniversaries are harder than others, but none of them are easy. And that's welcomed. I thought maybe that's a bad thing to do, because you're bringing, oh, that's right, here's the anniversary day. But I think the body, even if the mind doesn't recognize it, the body knows that another year's rolled around and there's something off, that you might just feel like you're a little sad today. Oh, that's right, this is the day that so-and-so was killed. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that. You don't have to dwell on it. It's not bringing up the past. It's just saying, hey, there's somebody else. I'm thinking about you today. There's someone else who's been in those shoes, and we're together on this. You don't have to carry it alone. I'm just thinking about you. And I think that's always been a welcome thing in my experience, which was another surprise. Who knew?
I have to say, I can't imagine anybody not welcoming you. Um, and I also want to say that, and I'll edit this out for the podcast, of course, but you are so good at this. The amount of editing that I'm going to have to do is so minuscule, and I'm only going to have to edit for time, because you are so. It's not just that that you articulate it so well, it's that you've thought about it so deeply. And so what you're articulating is so profound. I mean, this is the this is by far the easiest interview I've done so far.
Well, thank you. I'm really rambling. So
That's wonderful. You're great. Keep doing what you're doing. So, just one last question before we wrap up, and I like to end all interviews this way. Um, is there anything I didn't ask you that you think I should have, or you wish I would have?
nothing comes to mind. I mean, you're a great interviewer, leaving time for me to ramble and everything. Yeah, nothing, I can't think of anything. I mean, there's all different, this is like a porcupine, there's all different ways to come at this topic. So I
Yeah.
think we hit the ones that are important to me.
Well, one of the things that I loved about our earlier conversation, and one of the reasons that I wished that I had been recording, and I believe you made this similar remark when you spoke at the wall. Um, you make a beautiful distinction between closure and closer.
Oh, okay.
Would you mind going over that for me?
Sure. Let's see. In talking about these things, a lot of times you hear the word closure, and I don't use the word closure. I don't mind when other people use it, but to me, the word that more accurately describes my journey is closer. I feel that I have become closer to my brother through this whole thing, meeting pilots, crew members, going to Vietnam, going to reunions, meeting other family members, because the book was closed for 26 years. And it wasn't that I needed to have any specific information. When I started my search, I didn't really know what I wanted to know. And I just took what people wanted to share with me. And that really, truly has brought me closer to my brother. And I feel that his presence with me, sometimes I'll be sitting at my computer, typing an email to a family member, or really spilling my soul to somebody, and I'll hear a helicopter overhead going over the house. No, I'm not crazy. I really do hear it sometimes. And now that I live in Alabama, I hear Chinooks sometimes, which is really exciting. But I think you really can become closer to someone after they're gone. And who would have known that? People are only on this earth for a very short time, and I think I know my brother now more intimately for what he didn't do than for what he did. He never had the first gray hair. He never had a mortgage payment. He never had a credit card. He never got to become a dad or a grandpa. Um, but I do know what he was like. I have become closer to him, and I feel great peace in knowing that he will always be remembered, especially by the guys who flew with him and served with him and did what he did in another part of Vietnam. And there's something about knowing that their memory will always be carried forward that brings you the kind of peace that you need for healing. I don't use the word closure for that, but if people use that word, it's fine. Some people have a great many questions and want to put something to rest. I wanted to just wake it up, and I woke it up, and so I do Vietnam all the time, every day now, and it's not a scary thing anymore to me. It's something that's a part of my life, and as many tragedies go, I have experienced something that changed my life and decided, what am I going to do with that? You can't change what happens to you, but it's totally within your control how you're going to react to it. And so Vietnam now has given me the most close family members one could ever hope to have, has given me knowledge and learning and ability to help other people. And that's a very human need also. We all need to be able to help others. It's given me my wonderful, loving husband, whom I would not know if not for the Vietnam War. So tragedy can give rise to things that are beautiful, and closure can give rise to a closeness to something that's a relief, that's a healing part of the process. And I really hope that I hope for that for other people too. I really do.
I know I said that was going to be the last question. I lied because there's one more.
No problem.
If you could go back in time and talk to the Julie who was at the very beginning of the search, what would you tell her?
Oh, that's a great question, Michael. I guess I would say that that there isn't anything that you're going to do that's going to make it worse. I would take away a little bit of that concern and that hesitancy, and in its place, I would give that Julie a little bit more confidence that that this is going to result in something good. This isn't going to cause pain. It's going to help take away some of the pain, both for yourself and your family, as well as those that you interact with. And that it's all going to be okay. That things are going to be okay in the end, that you're not going out there adrift without a life preserver in any way, that there are a lot of supports and a lot of good things that will come your way because of what you're doing, that you don't have to be afraid or hesitant about this big, huge thing that was the Vietnam War, that it's conquerable. I think I would say that.
Well, thank you, Julie. This has been wonderful. I'm going to stop the recording now.